So I am going to introduce our first reader, which is Frank, and I'll grab my notes and tell you a little bit about Frank Farrelly, who is from Waterford. His poems have appeared in Poetry Ireland Review, The Stinging Fly, Shop, Cranach, The Honest Ulsterman, Moth, Southworth, and other magazines. He won the Rush Poetry Prize in 2017, the Frances Ledwidge Award in 2021, and the Fingal Poetry Prize in 2022. He was a runner-up in the Gregory O'Donoghue Prize, the Fish Poetry Prize, the Doolan Prize, Poets Meets Politics, and Northwest Words. He was shortlisted for the Writing Spirit Award, Kurt New Writing, if I pronounce that correctly, and the Trim Poetry Prize, highly commended in the Goldsmith Prize and the Blue Nib Chapbook Contest number 6. In 2017, he published his first pamphlet, Close to Home, with the help of a literary bursary from Waterford Art Links. In 2019, he was selected for Poetry Ireland Introduction Series. His first full collection, The Boiler Room, was published by Revival Press in 2020. And it's a little tradition over here at Poetry Lit that I do a little reflection of a poet's work before we start the reading. And so I've read through Frank's poems online, and I found that these are poems that take us on a trip through daily life and make it real again, or maybe realer than it was before. And in one poem, for instance, it's an orange that's put away in a locker and then gets eaten by a lake and leaves its lingering smell. In another poem, it's also a scent of patchouli that becomes a presence in its own. There are otherworldly images, in a way of speaking, of astronauts sleeping, but also all too worldly images of schoolboys sitting like penitents or weeks stretched long like prisoners on the rack. I think these poems know how to take a small moment and make it significant and touching. And with that, Frank, I would love to ask you the question that I have for the featured poets today. And my question is, what was the first poem or poet that you loved? Frank, were you there?
Do you want to take that first, Geraldine?
Oh, no, Frank, it's for you the question.
What's for me? Sorry.
Yeah, and then you do your
Mila.
reading, and then we have Geraldine.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my screen is freezing from time to time.
Oh, okay.
And thank you for the introduction. I didn't really know you'd read all of it. Thank you very much. So you're asking which is the first poem I remember of all time?
Loved. The first poet or poem that you loved.
Loved. Well, I was thinking of the first poem that I even remember. It's not necessarily a poem I loved, but it's the first poem I remember. And I suppose I loved it because it's still in my head. It's called Tarantella by Hilaire Belloc. It's quite a long poem. I'd like to read some of it. And I loved it because of the sounds and the exotic appeal that it had for me as a young boy. Okay? So I'll read part of Tarantella by Hilaire Belloc, written in 1923. Some people might remember it. It's basically an exercise in rhyming. Okay. Tarantella. Do you remember an inn, Miranda? Do you remember an inn? And the tedding and the spreading on the straw for a bedding, and the fleas that teased at the high Pyrenees, and the wine that tasted of tar, and the cheers and the jeers of the young muleteers, under the vine of the dark veranda. Do you remember an inn, Miranda? Do you remember an inn? So that's all I'll read of it. Thank you.
Oh, that's really lovely. Thank you.
It's just something that's early memory. Yes, early memory.
No, I'd love to invite you to read some of your work to us.
Right. So I will read some of my own work now. Okay. You suggest maybe 10 minutes maximum. Okay. So you can stop me if I go over time. But maybe I will write. I would like to read maybe 5 poems. All right. The first poem I'd like to read is a poem called The Jacket. And this is a recent poem. And the jacket is a jacket I bought when I was 18. And it's the only jacket that ever meant anything to me because it was destroyed. So I bought it on the same day that I saw Rory Gallagher playing in concert in Cork. And I liked the lumber jacket that he was kind of wearing. Anyway, my mother didn't like it too much. So here is the poem, The Jacket. With collar up and fists dug deep like Dylan on freewheeling, I could be James Dean or Robert Mitchum. I could be a drifter with a string of wet-eyed women. I could be somebody. I wore it everywhere except to church. At that, my mother drew the line. One day she flung it in the wash and hung it like a punishment killing. Bought a new one at the sales when I was busy with exams. Coffin brown, machine washable, 100% polyester waterproof. I forced it on, zipped it like a body bag, met the eyes of girls and days of rain and disappointment. In it, I faced the question of myself. In it, I had nowhere to hide. Thank you. Second poem is a bit longer, and it's based on a trip to Zagreb in Croatia with my wife. And we found this museum called the Museum of Broken Relationships, which is a real place. And there are exhibits and objects there which symbolize the breakup between former lovers. And they have little descriptions explaining their lives. So I imagined I had this kind of fear afterwards. So here's the poem, based in the Museum of Broken Relationships in Zagreb. It's called Breaking Up. Breaking Up. In the foyer, a busker belts out, "Love me do." The cashier smirks like she knows a sucker when she sees one. You stop to study every object. I glance perfunctorily, indulge a little schadenfreude, continue to the next. Soon we lose each other in the labyrinth. I circle back to the museum shop, all its corny merchandise, buy a coffee, find myself imagining you met someone between the furry handcuffs and the rubber pig. Someone who fills some lack you mourn in me. Inattention to detail, conclusion jumping to a fault. My head spins, panic-wrenched I am already agonizing what to mark our break. That Beatles hit, this overpriced latte. Then you appear, radiant in the dark mouth of the maze. I perk up like a child, gather myself, wave palely as an effete poet, too wearied by the world to even fake a smile. Thank you. Just three others, if I could. One is called, this is about my mother. It's called Night Duty. And when she was quite ill, she died 2 years ago. But when she was ill, she was housebound, and myself and my brother and sisters took turns to stay overnight with her. And this is one night I stayed overnight with her. And I discovered her spirit. Night Duty. Just a detail here, my father was a policeman all his life. So night duty might have a connection with that. Okay, Night Duty. Pleased at day's end to be lying warm in bed, night supplies to hand, cranberry juice, tonic water. Whiskey, she swears, sends her back when bad dreams wake her up at 3. An upright page declaring today is Thursday. Confusion often trips her up at dawn. Her radio set just right, her walker within easy reach. I say good night, go down to watch TV. John Lennon, in Disarming Scouse, explains to a stoned American how carry that weight doesn't mean a thing. Then she calls me. On the landing, hands against the wall, she wonders if I'm going out for a drink. Too cold, I say. I'm staying in. Where's your walker? I forgot. You forgot? Yes, I forgot. With a smile that charms me like a child. The same, I'd say, that 60 years ago arrested him, the night my father stopped her. She returning from a dance with friends. He on the beat. He asked her name, advised her kindly not to cycle in the dark without a light. Thank you. Just 2 more poems. One is called Waiting, and it's a poem about I suppose the moment you realize that you're growing out of childhood and that your links with your parents are no longer necessary at that time. So it's called Waiting, and I used to go fishing with my father. So this is a poem based on that incident. Okay, Waiting. A boy travels at death of day to an empty beach to fish for sea bass with his father. First they cast, stake their rods deep in sand to take the strain. Side by side they face the sea, his father's eyes fixated on the twitching line, his own on the glittering stars. Then something happens and he remembers distant things. The time he swam without his father holding him afloat, or walked to school alone, both hands dangling free. Now he knows that nights like these are numbered, now takes it in. The purple ocean in the lunar light, the sigh of dying waves, hills like giants waiting to awake. Thank you. Finally, this is a poem I wrote quite some time ago, and again, it's an autobiographical sort of experience. I tend to write from memory a lot. I remember working one summer in Ireland, in the Midlands, working on a bog, and I was a student, but the full-time workers were from the country and they were from the mountains, a lot of them. And they didn't really mix with what they called us townies. We lived in the town, Portlaoise, and they didn't really mix with us. But one particular man spoke to me one day, and I didn't forget it. I didn't forget. His name was Paddy Day. So this is the poem. On Cool Namona Bog. Distance is something we respect. Each tends his own wall, moves at his own pace. Some slow, methodical, others quick and furious. Morning stretches lines of turf across the plain. When it rains, we sit, gamble wet time pay. Tight of tongue and sharp at cards, Paddy Day keeps his thoughts close to his chest. For weeks, I only see the shadow his cap makes over his face. Like a dark bird on the horizon, he is the quickest, most furious of all. He lives under a small mountain, mixes with his own kind, distrusts towny types like me. Then one day, after the death of my friend, his dark shape crosses the trench, stands aslant against the sun. Paddy Day is sorry for the accident to have occurred. His words piled methodically, like heavy sods. A brown forefinger pushes his cap, enough to see how hard this is for him, how much he isn't bluffing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Frank, for a lovely reading.